Hey, you guys, welcome back to the salon. So, I figured that since I already discussed season one and season two of Masters of Horror, and also discussed the made for network TV unofficial third season of that, which was actually called Fear Itself, but was otherwise kind of the same, I figured I might as well complete the set, as it were, and talk about the even less well known and even more short lived offshoot anthology series, which was called Masters of Science Fiction, which actually I'd never even heard of until the friend who told me about Fear Itself also told me about this. So this was actually produced by most of the same people involved with Masters of Horror and Fear Itself, including Mick Garris and some other people. But this time they focused less, I feel like, on kind of iconic genre directors and more on adapting stories by legendary writers in the sci-fi genre. So Masters of Science Fiction was made for ABC in 2007. Now, the network ordered an initial run of 6 episodes, but then they only ran 4 of them for whatever reason. So the series, which was actually hosted only in voiceover by Stephen Hawking, was broadcast in full later on the same year by the Canadian channel, which was called Space. I don't know if that's what it's still called. And in 2012 was aired on the Science Channel under a different name. It was actually called Stephen Hawking's Sci-Fi Masters, but it was the same show. Now, I admit that I am way, way, way more into horror than I am into sci-fi. But in spite of that, I actually did enjoy most of these 6 episodes, which are, at least as of this recording, and at least in the United States, you can watch them for free on YouTube or on the Roku channel. I think you can see them elsewhere, but I think like you have to pay $1.99 or something like that. But they're free on YouTube or on Roku. So the episodes, like most anthology series, they were a little bit uneven, but they do actually feature, a veritable smorgasbord of award-winning acting talent. I mean, there's like some really big actors in here and adaptations of stories by some really beloved like sci-fi writers. Now, according to an article that I read online, which came out several years ago, the series ultimately failed, they felt like, because the ABC Entertainment president at the time, whose name was Stephen McPherson, he didn't really care for the show, and so like sort of relegated it to this loser time slot, which is like 10 p.m. Saturday night, which like nobody wants that time slot because they figure, most people are out and about because it's a weekend. And interestingly, that's kind of like some similar shit to what NBC pulled with Fear Itself. So I totally believe that can happen. Go watch my Fear Itself video if you want to like see what shenanigans NBC pulled. But it seems like ABC did the same thing with this series, only like to a more egregious degree. But at any rate, let's dig into this series and see what we can see. So this was a pretty decently gripping start to the series, and spoiler alert, this one actually ended up, after I watched all of them, this one actually ended up being my favorite one. And even though the bulk of the runtime consisted mainly of like 2, albeit great and Oscar-nominated actors playing a kind of psychological cat and mouse game inside like one office, essentially, there was still enough drama to keep me like completely engaged in the story, though I will admit that I saw where the story was going about halfway in, maybe sooner than that. But that didn't really diminish my overall like enjoyment of the episode, though, because like the acting was really good and it was just like a good story, even if you could kind of see where it was going mostly. So this was actually based on a 1985 short story, which was then turned into a 1986 stage play by the very prolific sci-fi writer John Kessel. And this was adapted for the screen by the TV writer Sam Egan, who was a producer on this show, I think, and also, incidentally, wrote the screenplay for the 1988 film Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. So, I love finding little, nuggets of information like that. And it was directed by Mark Rydell, who seemed like a little bit of an odd choice because I kind of feel like he has a lot of filmmaking credits, but it seemed like most of his stuff was like TV westerns, like Gunsmoke and stuff like that. And then, like, when he did movies, he would usually do dramas. Like he did The Rose, he did On Golden Pond, he did For the Boys. He did like a bunch of more movies like that, like mostly like dramas and comedies, that kind of stuff. So A Clean Escape begins with one of our 2 main characters, Dr. Deanna Evans, who's played by Judy Davis, who I love. She's great. She gets a very, very grim cancer diagnosis at some unspecified date in the future. I think it's supposed to be somewhere around like 2027 or 2030 or somewhere like that, which is only like a few years away, which is like fucking mind-blowing to think about. But like I said, this series came out in 2007, so it seemed like way in the future, like to them, I guess. But now it's just like, holy shit, that's only like 5 years away. That's fucking crazy. So then we go on to follow her at what is presumably her job. She sits in a very kind of swanky office, and she's sort of contemplating a gun that she has stashed away in her desk drawer. Then a guy comes in, and his name is Mr. Havelman, and he's played by Sam Waterston. And he's basically like, well, I'm not really sure I'm in the right place. Like they told me down at the nurse's station, this is where I'm supposed to come. This is where I'm supposed to come to. So Dr. Evans is like, yeah, you're in the right place. And then starts like firing questions at him. Now, from the context of the questions and the way that he's answering them, it's clear pretty quickly that she is a psychiatrist and he seems to be having trouble with his memory. Like one of the first things that clues you in is that he apparently believes that he's still 41 years old, even though he's obviously about 2 decades past that. So as their sessions unfold, more and more information gets revealed about who this man is and why why in particular he's being prodded into remembering the 20 odd years that he's apparently like stuffed down the memory hole. There's also some question about how much he actually does remember. Like with Dr. Evans, she pretty much thinks that Haverman has very conveniently checked out, like out of his mind, it's like, oh, I don't remember anything. I don't know if she necessarily thinks he's consciously faking, but that he's like subconsciously faking to avoid taking responsibility for some really monstrous thing that he did at some point in the past. Now, I won't spoil what that is, but suffice it to say that I don't want to say it's somewhat political in nature. It is political in nature. I haven't read the 1986 play that this is based on, but I did read the synopsis, like on Wikipedia, and it's pretty much the same as the episode, though the story, like this episode, has been updated specifically to reflect like the particular political stuff that was going on in 2007, which is the year that the series aired. So like I said, I actually really liked this opening installment. It's essentially like a bottle episode, but the interplay between the two actors was great. I mean, those are just two great actors, and it was really, they had like a good rapport with one another, and all the twists and revelations and the plot like kept coming at a steady pace. I predicted what was going to happen, or like roughly what was going to happen, but that didn't really bother me all that much because, just seeing the events play out was just like really satisfying. And I wasn't entirely sure how it was going to go. There was like some little stuff, but you know what I mean? I don't know. I just really liked it, even though I could kind of see where it was going. And it also made me look forward to the 5 upcoming episodes. So it totally did its job in that regard. So that was like a good one to start out with, I feel like. I have to say, though, I was a little bit less enthusiastic about the second episode, which to me came across as like way too heavy-handed, like, and even kind of like bordering on cheeseball. Although it's always nice to see Terry O'Quinn in something, like, he was in Lost. I think most people know him from that, but I actually know him from the Stepfather movies because he was like, back in the 80s, he was great in that. So he's in this and he's like really great. So this was actually directed by Michael Petroni, who probably best known for writing the screenplays for Queen of the Damned. I'm not going to blame him for that one. The Rite, that movie with Anthony Hopkins in it about the exorcism, and the third Chronicles of Narnia movie, which was that the Prince Caspian or Voyage of the Dawn Treader? I can't remember. I didn't see any of them. I read the books, but I didn't see any of the movies. And it was actually based on a 1970 short story called The General Zapped an Angel by Howard Fast. Now, this story starts with there's like a helicopter crash in the Iraqi desert. Like apparently something has hit this helicopter and has brought it down. So there's an American soldier and an Iraqi soldier, and they're kind of facing off across the dunes. But then, like, while they're mutually like pointing guns at each other or whatever, they discovered that they can inexplicably understand each other's languages. So then while the American guy is like kind of, looking for his buddy or whatever, both of them see like this weird being in the sand that kind of like zaps their eyes and puts them in a sort of coma. Although their eyes are open, and they seem to be like, when they take them back to the lab and like kind of hook them up to machines and stuff, they don't seem to be like in any pain or distress or anything like that. They seem to be experiencing a state of like extended bliss, but they're basically just like sitting there with their eyes like just staring into nothing. So there's a woman named Lieutenant Granger, who's played by Elizabeth Rome, or Rem, I guess it's German, and it's got an umlaut. And she's actually in the military, but she's also an astrophysicist for SETI. And she is sent on a mission to coax a guy named Major Albert Skinner, who's played by Terry O'Quinn, out of retirement. Because I guess he's apparently the guy that you go to with anything that has to do with like the extraterrestrial kind of question. Now, Skinner is a UFO skeptic, and he's convinced that this whole thing that's happening is a hoax, but he goes along anyway out of curiosity. So it turns out that this thing that they found in the sand that presumably brought the helicopter down or whatever is humanoid and is genetically almost identical to human beings, other than a single missing chromosome. And it shoots like golden laser things out its eyes and puts more people into like the chill comas. And at some point, it starts to communicate by like making all the people in the chill comas like, you know, move their hands. And then if you put a pen in their hand, they start like writing stuff down. And basically, this being starts to use passages from all different religions' holy books to essentially like berate humans for being violent motherfuckers and, you know, their inability to get along with one another, shit like that. So the president of the United States and his advisors are pretty sure that this alien is just pretending to be all groovy and mellow in order to get us to disarm or get rid of our nuclear weapons. And they're like, fuck that. We need to like strike first, ask questions later, because it's like they think it's a trick. The leaders of the other countries, though, believing that this entity is essentially God, they actually threaten to nuke the U.S. back to the Stone Age if we try anything funny against this interstellar visitor. So it's not too much of a spoiler, because it's right there in the title of the source short story that this being is basically an angel. You know what I mean? I think I would have liked this one better if it was like more satirical, like if it was like a black comedy, like along the lines of Dr. Strangelove or something like that. But I think the problem with it is just so earnest that it comes across as like really cringy. You know, even though the sentiment is obviously nice enough, but I don't know. There was just something about this one that went a little too far into like the kind of like Lifetime movie kind of direction, like a sci-fi Lifetime movie, and I wasn't about it. Okay, now see, this one is a little bit more what I'm talking about when I'm talking about maybe going a more humorous or satirical route. This one leans very, very hard into the humor and the absurdity, which thus makes it a lot more entertaining. So this was actually directed by Michael Tolkien, who was a screenwriter behind several movies, including Gleaming the Cube, The Rapture, that one with Mimi Rogers, The Player, which actually I think he won a lot of awards for, and Deep Impact. And this was actually loosely based on a 1947 short story by Robert Heinlein. So this episode actually deals with the ethical question of genetically created anthropoids and whether they merit the same rights as a human being does. Now, incidentally, the original story, which is actually quite famous, asked the same question, but it wasn't about like this one. It's kind of like a clone or a genetically created human, whereas in the story it was about a genetically modified chimpanzee who was campaigning to be treated equally under the law. So this episode actually updates the story, I guess, to make it more relevant in light of, you know, human cloning and the possibility of genetic enhancement, things like that. Though, to be honest, I think it might have been cooler, though undoubtedly more cost prohibitive, if they had gone with the chimp. I would actually kind of really like to see that. So the story is set in, I think, 2077. And large corporations, including one that's run by a genetic scientist named Tibor Karguru, who's played by a deliciously mercenary Malcolm McDowell. You can tell he's just having a fucking blast with this role. These companies produce not only disposable humanoids that are called Joes, they produce them for, various dangerous and menial jobs that other people don't want to do. But as a sideline, they also make these bizarre genetic abominations like six-legged dachshunds and things like that for wealthy customers who are kind of like looking to show off, you know what I mean? So to that end, the company is visited by the seventh wealthiest woman in the world, Martha von Vogel, who's played by the recently deceased Anne Heche, and her ridiculous boy toy husband, a caddy named Bronson, who's played by Russell Porter, who has like ridiculous hair, like the sherbet colored suit. So Bronson wants the company to make him a Pegasus because he thinks that'll really like make the other elites at the club like really envious. But Cargrew basically tells him, it's like, look, the logistics of a flying horse, it's going to produce this monstrous creature that is just not going to be consistent with your expectations. It's like it would have to be like 10 feet wide, and like its wings would be so big it would cover it like a tent. It's not going to look like what you think a Pegasus is going to look like. So he actually like talks them down from that, and he sells them instead on this adorable fully grown adult elephant, but that's only like the size of maybe like a large cat. Like it is super cute. Like it's CGI, but it's super cute. Oh, and also this little elephant can read and write, and his name is Napoleon, and he comes with his own little bed, which Malcolm McDowell like helpfully points out. He even comes with his own little bed, which I thought was very funny. While they're on their way out of the facility, though, Martha is kind of like distracted by one of the Joes who keeps insisting that his name is Jerry, and he keeps asking for candy and cigarettes, and he also looks as though he's trying to ask Martha for help, which technically they're not really supposed to be able to do. Now, Cargrew explains to them, it's like, oh, this particular Joe was one, his intended function was to sweep minefields, but now that his job isn't needed anymore, he's actually going to be liquidated and turned into dog food. They said that's what they do when they don't need the Joes anymore. These are humans. They've just made them, like, and grown them, you know what I mean, for specific tasks. So Martha, who is actually like, obviously very excessively privileged, but she's not an entirely shitty person. She actually offers to buy Jerry, or at least to lease him to keep him from getting killed. So once Jerry moves into her mansion, Martha starts going on this crusade to give all Joes the same rights as natural-born humans have, which was actually kind of funny because it came across to me like something of a parody of these kind of like really wealthy celebrities who campaign for various causes. Like sometimes their heart is in the right place, but they come across looking sort of clueless and out of touch, like with regular people, because they don't really live in the regular world. So they were kind of like parodying that, I feel like, a little bit with her character. Now, this one was actually pretty damn funny. And it was clear that everyone involved was just having the best fucking time, and they were just like having a blast with it. Now, if you like your sci-fi darker or more serious, then you're going to find this like way too broad for your liking, I feel like. And it does hammer home its themes like pretty overtly, but because it's played for laughs, I think it gets away with that kind of overt messaging like a lot better than the previous installment, The Awakening, did. This one's obviously not for all taste, and it's kind of silly like overall, but not gonna lie, it made me laugh, like especially like Malcolm McDowell. And if you're into Robert Heinlein stuff, then you should probably check it out at some point. So this was another good one with some really entertaining acting performances and a really effective, like downbeat, very cynical tone that was nonetheless kind of leavened a little bit, I guess, by a lot of gallows humor, which I really like. So this was based on a 1959 short story by Harlan Ellison, and it was directed by good old Jonathan Frakes. Riker from Star Trek The Next Generation also hosted that fun series Beyond Belief, Fact or Fiction, which I was always a big fan of. So The Discarded is actually set, I think it's 37 years after a horrible plague started sweeping through Earth's population. So, it's timely. The disease is actually known as RIGM, which is from the acronym RIGM, which stands for Random Idiopathic Genomic Mutation, or sometimes it's known more crassly as blood poop. So you get to see John Hurt say blood poop lots of times in this. So, if that was your fetish, this is the thing for you. So this disease basically makes everyone who's infected with it mutate in really unpredictable ways, like growing new limbs, like, growing a single eye in your forehead, like shit like that. You know what I mean? Now, the first people that were stricken with Rigum, who are known as the Discarded, were placed on this self-sustaining vessel and like pretty much kicked off the earth and like set adrift in space to keep them from spreading the contagion to everybody else. So the Discarded, not surprisingly, are a little bit cranky and a little bit despondent about this situation, about their lot in life, especially since the ship that they're living on isn't really all that well maintained. It's like, other than, the occasional shipments from Earth, the denizens are kind of like, they call it like the garbage scow, and they've kind of been forced to figure stuff out for themselves because, every now and then, like, the Earth ship will forget to bring toilet paper and shit like that. So they have to, like, compromise. Now, the most misanthropic of all of the people on the ship, I think there are like 96 or 93 or something like that, like at the beginning of the story, because there's a lot of suicides and stuff like that, so they're keeping count of how many people are still there, and I think they say at the beginning that there are still 93 of them. So the most misanthropic of these is a guy named Bedzik, who's played by Brian Dennehy, and he's just this big, gruff hulk of a dude with one enormously mutated arm. Like, he's normal looking, but then he has like this really big, like, elephantitis kind of arm. Now, he's super, super grumpy, but in spite of this, it seems like everybody on the ship sort of looks to him as though he's kind of like the captain or the leader, even though there's technically really isn't one, but everybody just kind of thinks of him in that regard. And so whenever they have a problem, they always kind of like call him up to ask him his advice on it. Now, Bedzik has a close friend and his temperamental opposite, a guy named Sam Swope, who's actually played by a delightfully scenery-chewing John Hurt. John Hurt in this he's just this very witty Shakespearean gentleman who has this just outlandishly prolix way of talking, and also, by the way, has a little second head like sprouting out of his shoulder that sometimes insists that he is Sam Swope. You know what I mean? Like, so he's trying to like take over from the other guy. So yeah. Now, Sam Swope has actually maintained his sense of humor and some measure of optimism, like, in the face of their situation, whereas Bedzik is more kind of like, fuck this, like, he's like way more cynical. So they have like a lot of discussions about kind of their different philosophies in that regard, I guess. So as the Discarded are living their humble little lives far from their home planet of Earth and not really welcome back there as far as they know, possible hope arrives in the form of an ambassador from Earth whose name is Barney Curran. He's actually played by James Denton. Now, he has some news, and he also has a proposal for the residents of the ship. And this proposal, and again, I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it ends up causing a horrible, horrible rift between Bedzik and Sam Swope, and it kind of like tests their different ways, their different philosophies. Like I said, their different ways of like looking at the situation that they're in. Now, this one had a lot of black humor in it, which again, I very much enjoyed, but overall, it's a very tragic story, and one that might make you lose your faith in humanity. I mean, provided that you had any to start with. That said, I still liked it a lot, and I have to say that John Hurt is probably the only actor who could have pulled this character off, like the character of Sam Swope. I think in the hands of a different actor or a lesser man, I think the character could have come off as like irredeemably obnoxious, because he just goes around like spouting exposition and stuff like that, like cramming as many 50-cent words into like sentences as the sentence can possibly hold. So I think if anybody else tried to do it, it'd be like super, super annoying. But because John Hurt imbues his character with such warmth and such charm that he totally sells it, he totally gets away with it. So it almost seems like his penchant for verbosity, if you want to call it that, like, because that's kind of the way he talks too. I mean, I wrote down a sentence. This is what he talks like through the whole thing. He says, "In spite of your surly, one might even venture taciturn nature, mon ami, you remain an imposing and, whether you like it or nay, a de facto executive figure aboard this enchanted scow, the mutant horrors of which hold you in the very highest esteem." So all of his sentences are like that. And it's like, if anybody else like tried to do that role, you would just want to like punch them in the face. But for some reason, like John Hurt totally pulls it off and makes it seem more like a lovable, endearing kind of like just character quirk rather than the horrible like snotty affectation that makes you want to like reach through the screen and strangle him, which I kind of feel like if anybody else had played it, that probably would have been the case. But John Hurt like really fucking kills it here, and that's, like I said, that's no mean feat to like make a character like that like endearing, because yeah, that personality trait could get really old really fast, but I still kind of like found him very funny. Oh, and fun fact, Harlan Ellison actually makes a cameo appearance in this episode. He stars as Nate, who is one of the mutants on the ship. So this one, I was a little bit meh about this episode. Okay, so like after a brief prologue, it takes place pretty much entirely in one room, which isn't an episode killer. I mean, the first one, was like that too, and I liked that. But this one, I don't know. It's not a bad story. I kind of feel like maybe the problem with it was that it introduced too many ideas into its like pretty brief runtime, and I think that there was too much time spent on exposition to kind of like explain the mechanics of what was going on rather than just kind of like keeping it simple. And I think maybe that might be, I was thinking about this earlier, this might be why I'm not as big a fan of science fiction, because I kind of feel like science fiction, maybe even more than other genres, because there's so much world building involved in it, and maybe this is why I don't really dig fantasy that much either, is because there's so much world building in a book. Like, it doesn't bother me as much, but when they do a movie, it necessitates having so much exposition and build up to like explain the way the world works and stuff like that, and I feel like it just bogs the story down, depending on how complicated your world building is. And I think that maybe that, and the thing about this story in particular is I don't think it needed to be that complicated. I don't think they needed to add like some of the factors that they added, like about the mechanics of how the different like the wet work stuff kind of worked, like with all the neural networks and all that. I think they could have like simplified that down just to keep it like within the parameters of like a 45-minute episode. That's all I'm saying. So this was actually directed by Darnell Martin. She's actually directed episodes of Law and Order, Grey's Anatomy, like Walking Dead, like among other things, and was written by a very well-regarded crime author, Walter Mosley, and this was actually based on his own 2001 short story, and he also adapted it for the screen. So Little Brother follows this young man named Frendon Blythe. Now, he's played by Clifton Collins Jr., who was also in the Fear Itself episode that was called Family Man, which I talked about on the other video. So Frendon was born in this kind of underground bunker community situation that's called Common Ground, where I guess various undesirables or people that aren't really needed or something like that, they're kind of kept as background people. Like, they call them white noise because they just like don't, they just kind of like stay down in this bunker and don't really like do anything. Their lives are kind of regulated as though they're in prison, and they're only allowed like a 15-minute pass every 6 months, like to go outside and see the sun. So Frendon is really big. He really wants to escape Common Ground and go find his mom, like his biological mom. And when he has his 15-minute pass, he actually manages to escape, climbing through the razor wire, and he gets out into this place called Freedom Slum, which is about what you would imagine that it looks like. Now, a friend of his in Common Ground told him that he needed to look for a guy named Augustus who would help him if he could prove that he had a mind worth saving. So he finds Augustus almost immediately, but before anything can really come of that, there are like two cops who are bent on raping this little girl. So this little girl comes running down the alley toward Augustus and Frendon, and in the ensuing like battle or whatever, Augustus and the girl get killed, and then Frendon is kind of like obliged to kill the cops to try to defend the two of them, even though he's not successful. So like after this, Frendon gets caught and placed on trial. But in this future world, justice is actually doled out, not necessarily by humans, like a judge or a jury of your peers or anything like that, but by sort of like an automated system that's sort of been cobbled together and seemingly perfected from fragments of thousands of people's brains being like amalgamated into this ostensibly completely fair court. It's just like a being or something. It's just like an amalgamation. They just call it court. It has a face, but it's like a face like in a TV screen or something like that. And it's just kind of like I said, it's sort of like all collected, like all these brains like collected into one thing. So, and by the way, the accused are also hooked up to this special chair that can basically read their thoughts because it has like a thing into the back of their brain, and it can also like execute them if that's what turns out to be the sentence, which is like handy dandy. It's like all in one. So the bulk of the episode actually consists of Frendon trying to outwit the court and prove that he acted in self-defense and defense of others. There's also a little bit of a romance subplot, I feel like, introduced with like a newbie court official who's like, this is her first trial that she's witnessing or whatever. And her name is Tilly V. She's played by Kimberly Elise. And she's actually, like, unlike all of her other coworkers or whatever, is actually like sympathetic to Frendon's plight and thinks that he's innocent. So she's kind of thinks he's being railroaded. So the acting here is really good. And it's an interesting exploration of the concept of justice and, you know, whether we should ever put it in the hands of a seemingly impartial machine intelligence as opposed to a bunch of flawed human beings. But as I kind of alluded to before, I think this might have worked better like as a 45-minute TV episode if it either stuck completely with the whole trial conceit or devoted the whole story to Frendon escaping from common ground and finding freedom on the outside, like with Augustus and all that. You know, even if like the outside, like the freedom slum or whatever, was just as bad as where he grew up. Like as it was, I felt like the first part of the story that detailed his escape and him finding Augustus and all that, it was just kind of given really short shrift because it seemed like they only introduced it so he could commit a crime and get dragged back and like put on trial. Like the whole thing about his longing to find his mom and like the legendary status of like this Augustus person like on the outside who supposedly everybody knew about. It was kind of like given a lot of weight, like it was going to be like a through line like through the whole story, but then it was just kind of like forgotten about or like set aside a little bit, like just because the whole thing went into like a courtroom drama. So I think there were actually like two good stories here, but I think it would have been better if they were told separately or were told like in a longer format so that each aspect like had more room to develop and had more equal weight to them, I guess. I kind of would have liked to see it with just the trial thing, you know what I'm saying? Like rather than having this stuff at the beginning where he talked about his mom and the escape and Augustus and all that, because I thought that was going to be a lot more important than it ended up being. So this final episode was pretty decent too. Actually focused on the fears surrounding drone technology, which, you know, is still around nowadays. Also dipping into the same kind of like crime prevention themes as maybe like, you know, Minority Report, the Philip K. Dick story. It was directed by Harold Becker, who did, again, dramas mostly, Onion Field, Taps, Mercury Rising, that kind of stuff, and adapted from a story by another very prolific sci-fi writer named Robert Sheckley. So Sean Astin is in this, and he plays a scientist named Charlie Kramer who works at this, you know, high-tech like technology company. In particular, he's developed a very, very advanced drone program, which is called Watchbird. And the drones, which look like birds, obviously, hence the name, have been programmed with AI to learn and also to disseminate information like among themselves. Like all he has to do is tell like the main watchbird, you know, whatever the parameters are, and that watchbird will like kind of disseminate to the rest of the drones. You know what I'm saying? So these drones have been used with a bunch of success in Iraq and Afghanistan. But one of the hotshot executives at the company thinks, well, we should use these drones on American soil, like to stop criminals, like for law enforcement. So the CEO of the firm, whose name is Randolph Ludwin, and he's played by James Cromwell, he actually agrees with that. But Charlie is not really all that confident that the drones will work as well in domestic applications as they do in wartime applications. But nonetheless, he's kind of like strong-armed into reprogramming the technology to more fit in with a law enforcement kind of application. So everything seems to be going well at first. That's what usually happens. Like, the watchbirds are very, very quick. They're very efficient. They stun criminals before they can really do much harm, and they only kill them if necessary, like if they continue with what they're doing. Charlie still has reservations, though, and worries that something's bound to go wrong. He's like, some make mistakes. Machines make mistakes. There's glitches, shit like that. Now, for a time, it looks as though something absolutely has gone wrong. One of the drones kills a seemingly innocent young woman, like through the window of her apartment building. But then it turns out later on that the woman was actually right about to like poison someone, like the person she was with. But after that happens, like the company executives and Charlie realize that the drones can actually now sense murderous intent, like before anyone's actually even done anything, before anyone is aware of anything. And at that point, like, the CEO suggests that they loosen the restrictions on the drones in order to prevent crime before it occurs. Like I said, very much like Minority Report. Naturally, this goes horribly, horribly wrong in all kinds of ways. And, this one has the very shop-worn, but still very relevant theme of kind of asking us, like, how much freedom we're willing to give up for safety, like how much of our safety are we willing to put in the hands of like AI, which doesn't have human emotions, like things of that nature. So it's kind of exploring that as well. So this was a pretty solid swan song for the series. It wasn't my favorite. I think out of all of them, as I mentioned earlier, I think my favorite one was probably A Clean Escape, which was the first one, followed by The Discarded, the Harlan Ellison one. That was probably my second favorite. And I'm gonna say, like, all in all, this was a pretty enjoyable series, though probably not one that I would ever like watch again, that I would ever revisit, more because I'm not a huge sci-fi fan, not because I don't think it was any good or anything like that. So if you're interested at all in any of the authors that have been adapted here, it's definitely worth checking out if you have a few hours to kill. And like I said, if you have YouTube or the Roku channel, it's free on there. It's 6 episodes and it's uneven, but there's enough good shit in there to like absolutely make it worth watching. So that'll do it for this installment. Thanks for dropping by the salon today, and remember to like and share if you enjoy the content, and subscribe to Scare Salon if you haven't already. Also remember to go over to scaresalon.com, where I post more written content about horror, books and movies, things like that. And I will see you guys again on the next one. Bye.